Section 4. You will hear a lecture on American literature in the 20th century. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 10. Listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 10. In today's lecture, we are going to be talking about American literature in the 20th century, and in particular at two literary movements that shaped the nation's art and culture. In the 1920s, a group of American novelists, poets, and artists called the Lost Generation helped change the course of American literature. This group was greatly affected by the events of the First World War and used the horrors of war to develop new literary styles. Although this was a distinctly American movement, the authors of the Lost Generation mostly lived across the Atlantic in Paris, France. Poets like Gertrude Stein and T.S. Eliot were tremendously influential on the poetry of subsequent generations, and the authors Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald are among the most important novelists in American history. Their contributions have helped shape American art and culture for almost a century. Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby, is regarded as one of the most important books of the 20th century, examining the theme of the American dream. Several decades later, in the 1950s, another literary movement emerged, this time called the Beat Generation. Living mostly in New York City, the Beats were a product of the Second World War, and their work offered criticism of consumer culture in America, a country which was becoming increasingly wealthy. Many critics labeled the Beat Generation angry young men for their apparent rejection of traditional social values, but others see them as offering hope and peace. Their writings explore freedom and alternative lifestyles, and, like the Lost Generation before them, they were hugely influential on later American culture. Many of the great artists of the late 20th century credit the Beats with inspiring their work. Perhaps most famous of all, Beat author Jack Kerouac wrote a novel called On the Road, which changed the lives of countless young Americans and still inspires people around the world some 60 years later. America is still a young nation, and its literary history doesn't go back nearly as far as, say, England's, but as we have seen today, the 20th century was a time of substantial cultural change. What will this new century bring? We will have to wait and see, but you can be sure the writers and artists shaping the future will themselves have been influenced by the Lost Generation and the Beat Generation. Now, do we have any questions? That is the end of Section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers.